Good morning. Good morning again, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion. On behalf of the Economic Policy Committee of the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, we want to welcome you to our panel discussion on increasing affordable housing in Jamaica. My name is Stefan Wright, and I am with IDB Invest, and I will be your moderator this morning. This morning, we have a very distinguished panel with us, who I will introduce now. Mr. Dwayne Berbick, Manager Corporate Affairs and Public Affairs at National Housing Trust. Mr. Marvin Campbell, CEO of West Indies Home Contractors, WIHCON. Mr. Michael Neita, General Manager, Victoria Mutual Property Services. And we have three affiliates who we're going to ask specific questions as well at an appropriate time. Mr. Julian Mayer, Chief Investment Strategist at JMB. Gilberto Chona, Lead Housing Specialist from IDB, and Paola Bazan, Lead Investment Officer at IDB Invest. This morning, we intend to have a discussion among the panelists for about 50 minutes and then open the lines for questions. If you have questions in the interim, you can post it in the chat, as everyone will be muted until the question and answer period. Welcome again to everybody, and we hope to have a great discussion this morning. Today, we're going to talk about significantly increasing the stock of affordable housing units in Jamaica. Put another way, how do we eliminate squatter settlements in Jamaica? The international definition of affordable housing is wide and varied, but really it includes housing units that are affordable by that section of the society whose income is below the median household income. In Jamaica, that would include persons who make minimum wage, which today is around $7,200 per week. And in practical terms, we're talking about housing units which cost anywhere from about 6.5 million to about 15 million. And then you go into sort of more middle income. We know that affordable housing is a big problem in Jamaica. It not only impacts those who live in the substandard conditions, but it impacts all of us. We know of the poor educational outcomes, potential crime, the social ills that can result when people don't have access to proper housing, when they don't have access to proper electricity, water, sewage, roads. And so it's very important for us as a society to be able to develop low-income housing or affordable housing to meet the needs of a wide section of our population. The government estimates that the demand for these units, for affordable housing units, is approximately 15,000 units annually. But today we only produce maybe 6,000. And in general, over the last 40 years, the average has been about 4,000. Construction has a major role to play in our economy. It contributes around 6% of GDP. And so building more housing units can have a major role in terms of GDP contribution, but also in terms of jobs. And then obviously the satisfaction that the new homeowners would get from living in these units. We want to motivate. The real question we're trying to ask today is, how do we motivate the private sector to play a greater role in developing housing units? I'm going to start with Mr. Dwayne Berbick, who's the Manager of Corporate and Public Affairs at the National Housing Trust. Dwayne, we know that NHT was formed in 1976 to increase affordable housing units in Jamaica. In fact, NHT is one of the major organizations responsible for the development of affordable housing. And by some estimates, you provide close to 60% of housing solutions in Jamaica in some years. And the NHT really plays many roles, from master planner to developer to mortgagor. In this goal of increasing affordable housing in Jamaica, what would you say is the NHT's most important role today in solving the affordable housing crisis?
Pleasant morning to you, Stefan, and a pleasant morning to my fellow panelists and to all of the individuals who have joined us this morning this very important discussion. You're quite right in saying that the NHD has played multiple roles in the development of housing solutions in Jamaica. But I would say the NHD's two main roles at this time, we classify and we consider the National Housing Trust as a housing finance institution, which sums up those two roles, meaning that it's in the business of actual construction. While not considered a developer in the true sense, it facilitates the development of housing units, and also the finance side, where the NHD provides mortgages to the qualified contributors. So on the construction side, the NHD does that through a combination of initiatives, programs, to include the actual NHD schemes that the NHD would have built and put on the market. And over our 45-year history, we would have built in excess of 100 schemes. And as we speak currently, we have roughly about 40 that are under construction across various parishes in Jamaica. So the NHD would have also been able to look at our housing program to see how we can boost and ramp up that delivery of housing units in the last few years. And we would have ended financial year 2020-2021 having started construction on over 22,000 housing solutions over a 4-year period. Going back to those numbers that you would have indicated at the start, and comparing that to 22,000 housing starts over a 4-year period, by any definition, that's a significant improvement as it relates to increasing the stock of housing in Jamaica. And on the other side, the NHD also has relationships and partnerships with our developers. It's an institution that has been built on partnerships from day one, and that those partnerships exist today, where we have partnerships with developers under our guaranteed purchase program, where the NHD buys housing solutions that would have been built by developers that they make available to us. And of course, we in turn make those available to our contributors. And we also have a joint venture program. We have an interim finance program where the NHD provides loans specifically to developers who already have conceptualized and have a product, have a development that they want to get out of the ground. And on the financing side, of course, people know this widely, the NHD provides loans at some of the most attractive housing mortgage rates that you can find, with loans ranging from as low as 0% to a high of 4%, and not just attractive in terms of interest rates, but in terms of loan tenure, up to 40 years and even 60 years in the case of our intergenerational mortgages. So I think the NHD's position in the market is clearly defined as not just a facilitator of housing development, but also as a financier for qualified contributors as well.
Right, and let me stay with you for a minute. The question I do want to ask, right? So we have approximately 700,000 Jamaicans who live in what we would loosely call squatter settlements, which is probably about 20% of our population. And we know that, as I mentioned earlier, there is a demand for about 15,000 of these units every year. Now we're producing a little bit less than 6,000. There's a massive gap, right? But successive governments in recent times, maybe over the last 20 years, have really taken money out of NHD to do other things. And they're very needy things, but they're not housing construction, which is the NHD's mandate. And so the question I have is, even though we have this shortage, we see that resources are being taken away from the NHD. You add to that, there was a survey done by Capri recently in 2016, which referenced the fact that NHD really has too much money for what it's doing, right? In a way. There's a 5% contribution, 3% from employer, 2% from employee. And according to their study, NHD could do with 2% from the employers alone. And the question I have for you is, given this shortage and the dramatic need that we have for building housing units, with some of the surpluses going elsewhere, maybe you can just describe to us what you're currently doing with the surpluses, and how could you better use those surpluses to meet the dramatic housing shortage that we have?
Sure. I first want to say though, Stefan, surplus doesn't necessarily equate to cash. And people oftentimes look at the NHD's healthy balance sheet and see an asset base in excess of $300 billion and go, whoa, that looks good. But the reality is 85 to 90% of that is actually, you know, the housing solutions that we would have sold to persons and the mortgages that we would have held there. So the NHD's actual liquid cash is oftentimes over-exaggerated. And that is really distributed across items to include, as I mentioned, you know, mortgage receivables. So the cash is actually less than the operating surplus. To zero in on your specific question though, we have to look, in answering the question, we would have to look at contributions collected versus the actual expenditure of the NHD. So I believe at the point when Capri would have done that report was around maybe 2016. And if we go back, you know, those 5 years and look at what the NHD would have been spending then, you would have seen probably a housing budget in the region of high 20s, maybe $30, $31 billion annually. Fast forward to 2021, looking at as well as at the improvements in terms of ramping up the housing program that the NHD would have done, we're now talking about expenditure in the region of $50 billion annually. How much is the NHD collecting? The NHD is still collecting in the region of 30-something billion dollars. So that excess has to come from somewhere. So this surplus that we would have mentioned really has gone directly back into the housing program. And when you look at some of the initiatives and programs that the NHD would have been able to afford to our contributors as well, we're talking about 0% mortgages. We're talking about increased subsidies through home grants, where for our lowest qualified contributors, individuals who earn between minimum wage and $15,000 per week, the NHD is able to give them a $2.5 million home grant. And that's money, of course, as it suggests, a grant, you don't have to pay that amount. And you talk about direct subsidy that the NHD provides as well. When we sometimes go into a particular area and our housing demand tells us that this is the affordability here, and the housing prices come out above that affordability, it means the NHD has to apply a direct subsidy to be able to allow the contributors in that area to afford the units. And looking even at COVID, which took us all by surprise last year, the National Housing Trust would have been able to provide over a 2-year, 3-year period mortgage discount to existing mortgages of 1.5%. If you look at all that, and I'm sure my list is not exhaustive, you would realize that the NHDs would have had some amount of reduced income that would have taken place in the last 5-6 years. And of course, that would have been, you know, would have had to offset that through the surpluses that we would have developed over time. So if you look at the NHD's balance sheet, actually, that surplus figure, if you look at it over the last 5-6 years, you'd have seen it coming down. And that's not something we are shocked about because we know where the needs are. We know the demand is there, and we are committed to making the adjustments as it relates to policies, as it relates to programs, initiatives, and the deep partnerships to ensure that we are reaching as many of our contributors as possible and reaching, most importantly, the most needy of our contributors.
Excellent, Dwayne. I'm glad to know that you are putting the money back into working with those who need it most. Let me turn to Marvin Campbell, CEO of WIHCON, for a moment. Marvin, as a private sector entity, WIHCON is, like all other private sector entities, motivated by profit. But this is not a question of demand. There's demand for 15,000 of these units, and nationally we produce less than 6,000. What would motivate you and organizations like yours to develop more affordable housing? And what is the role that you think the government should play in enabling that?
All right, morning, Stefan. Morning to all the participants. Well, to play in this space of affordable housing, you have to be motivated more than just profit because it doesn't give the greatest of margins. And so from a WIHCON perspective, I mean, we're intrinsically motivated to help to solve this housing crisis as it relates to affordable housing. It's part of our DNA and it's part of the mandate of our founders. But I believe, what would really help us along this journey to be more successful, for starters, would be, greater access to large tracts of land that can facilitate mass housing development. And in many cases, these lands are owned by the government, right? So there's opportunity for partnership there. I believe as well, if there has to be a greater centralized master planning approach in terms of how we try to support mass housing for the price to be affordable. Because what happens presently, like each developer carves out a piece of land for themselves, and then they have all the high input costs, particularly as it relates to the infrastructure. But if you could get that centralized, where that's done, at a national level, where the infrastructure, particularly as it relates to, say, water and sewage, is in place, so that the developers themselves can focus on what they are really good at, the construction and the execution. That alone could reduce prices at an individual developer level at least 20 to 25%. Because as a typical, an average cost of what the infrastructure component is for the final construction of the unit. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there, access to land and reduction in the high infrastructure cost. And a lot of that, I believe, can be achieved through a greater centralized master plan approach, where it's not each person on their individual basis trying to go and solve this problem. Also, I think, on the part of the regulatory agencies, I believe the timeline and the turnaround for approvals can be significantly improved. Time is money, and, when a development is taken between conception to start 18 to 2 years to really get off the ground, that's just not quick enough. I know there's a commitment, for a 90-day turnaround period for approvals, but there's not consistency in terms of achieving that across the board. So there's significant room for improvement where that is concerned. And, also, and this is where I think a lot of the partnerships come in, especially with the NHT, in that, greater access to financing at lower interest rates, because that's a direct pass-through and a benefit to the homeowners and the contributors to the NHT. So I believe if we look on those pool of factors, if we can get those right, then we'll be in a much better place to truly, solve this crisis. You spoke about the surplus and the drawdown from the NHT, but I believe, that surplus which is available could be utilized in a more meaningful way, I believe, to truly address the mandate of providing affordable housing solutions to the contributors by having a more, centralized approach with the NHT playing, I believe, a greater role in helping to build out the infrastructure and then have developers now come in and build out the housing on these large tracts of land. Because what you find now.
Yeah, no, and that was one of the questions I had is, who do you see as this body that can play this coordinating role? Are we talking about the Ministry of Housing? Are we talking about HAJ or because NHT has the surplus, maybe they're really in the best position to advance some of these developments, at least play a role in the infrastructure and the land acquisition, etc.
So I think the ministry has to be, that central point that pulls all the key players together so we can have, this greater public-private partnership. So the NHT has a key role to play, but the ministry, I believe, has to pull, the private developers, the NHT, and the agencies together so that it's a more collaborative approach where we're all trying to achieve the same end goal.
Right. Let me put you on the spot a little bit then. So if NHT or some other entity was to make available, a large tract of land, 100 acres or whatever it is, and to, let's say, subsidize the cost of infrastructure and housing by 50%, you think you could build a unit for $5 million? And maybe, and it really depends on the size, right? Because obviously
it depends on the size. But if we have a case study. So we're doing Friendship now, right? Which is a joint venture with the ministry. And in our first phase, we're delivering units at around let's say $6.5 million.
Okay.
So if there's a 50% reduction in the infrastructure cost, you could come down to a $5 million unit.
Okay, excellent. Okay, all right, let me turn to Mr. Michael Neita, General Manager from Victoria Mutual Property. Good morning, Michael.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody else.
Okay, great. As one of the largest mortgagors in Jamaica, how do you look at the affordable housing sector? Is this something that is attractive to you? Maybe you can talk a little bit about if the default rates in this sector are any greater, or are persons who purchase these units, do they make their mortgages their number one priority?
All right, so firstly, VMBS was formed as a mutual building society, really to help landless people on the ladder for home ownership, over 100 years ago, 130 odd years ago. So that really is the mandate, and that mandate has continued through to the present. Mortgages form our biggest product in our portfolio and continues to play a very important role in that. So VM has had the experience of trying to solve this this problem, and we continue to look at it. Obviously, a significant part of this is affordability. People will have to to be able to pay for the property. Rates are a major condition. Term is a major condition. So we try to provide the best rates. NHT, as Dwayne indicated, offers very, very good rates, and that helps to solve the problem. We both have mutual agreements, joint financing agreements between the major financial institutions and NHT to help to reduce the cost of borrowing for mortgagors. So VMBS and other financial institutions, I think, are committed to trying to contribute to help and to solve this issue. In terms of defaults, I mean, defaults aren't intrinsic to people. They're more people's situations. So I don't think there's any predisposition to increase defaults at particular segments of income earnings. So I don't think that there's any intrinsic bias to default to lower income. Everybody wants to own their own home. Everybody wants to be able to grow and advance. So I don't think there's an issue there. There's an issue in terms of employment and income. So if a particular sector goes down, and that particular sector has a profile of employees in that sector, then that sector would be, or geographic area would be affected adversely.
Right. Well, that's good to know that there's no systemic sort of issue with default rates, right? Because you do want to, mortgage companies obviously have a key role to play, and you do want them to be motivated and interested in providing support to this sector. So it's good to know. What I hear from you is that basically, defaults are more individual based or maybe sector based on specific issues, but there's really no general systemic, reason or rationale why the default rates are lower for affordable housing, which is good to know. All right, let me turn to Julian Mayer, Chief Investment Strategist at GMMB Group. Julian, I would love to get your perspective on the role of investment banks and really even institutional investors in making capital available for affordable housing. Clearly, construction is very expensive. The margins are thinner. I just wanted to get your sense of the level of interest of the institutional financial institutions to the sector.
Morning, Stefan. Well, we the investment banking side is certainly won't play the role that VM or NHT would play in these sorts of opportunities, but there is a role for us. The discussion that we've been having and the comments by Marvin, I think, really hit to the core of where it is that investment banks can be particularly helpful in the infrastructure. When we look at an affordable housing project, and I think you started it off by talking about this massive scale and massive need for housing solutions, for squatter settlements. People are currently living in squatter settlements and so forth. So we are talking about large projects that have scale to warrant commercially viable infrastructure projects around maybe energy, whether it is to the sewage or water supply, whatever else. If we're talking about large enough projects, then there's a role for investment banks. Small projects would be tough for investment banks really to go and provide any sort of a solution, any sort of a benefit with regards to bringing down the infrastructure component, outsourcing the infrastructure component. But on large projects, we certainly can play a role. Recently, and I know in our previous discussions, I had spoken to you about a project in Dominican Republic, called One Bush. What the government did there was they basically took on all of the infrastructure components, and just as Marvin would have spoken to, the reduction in cost was massive. We're talking about anywhere from 20 to 40% reduction in cost per unit. No, that's the sort of, based on the target market we're talking about, that's the sort of move that actually makes affordable housing affordable. But it went further, right? It was a large enough development that it's actually, it would have captured all of the components required for that quantum of people being in a single area. So that would include schools, would have included medical facilities, would have included a number of other items. And when you look at what this, what it does to disposable income, when you cut out those transportation costs associated with getting kids to school and all the rest, this also makes affordable housing that much more affordable. So with a large enough plan, a well thought out plan, investment banking side certainly can play a role. We do know that that technology has improved. Cost of energy generation is significantly lower now than it was in the past, and it's significantly lower than people are paying over JPS. There's adequate spread there to justify energy solutions as a part of these sorts of projects, to justify, if adequate margin is there, to justify doing a lot of the other infrastructure components as a part of the overall investment from the private sector. So again, it's a case by case. Critical component, however, is scale. So it has to be large, it has to be well thought out, and it has to be an opportunity for the private sector to be able to step in, do these aspects of it, the infrastructure aspects, and make a financial return.
Thanks, Julian. And I mean, what I hear from you is really just underscoring the importance of the master plan, right? It's not just to build a few units here and there, but it's really to coordinate large-scale developments which have economies of scale, can access cheaper financing, and where the government can step in and provide some kind of potential subsidies in terms of the land and the infrastructure. From JMB Bank perspective, is this an attractive market as a mortgagor to homeowners?
I wouldn't want to necessarily speak to JMB Bank appetite for low-income mortgages. We certainly do provide mortgages, right. and we don't discriminate. So anybody who can be a client of the bank can certainly speak to the bank about mortgages, and we would look to go and provide that. But I think NHT, based on the target market that we're talking about here, is probably they're the biggest player in the space.
Right.
We are all complementary to that.
Right. Okay, makes sense. All right, so let me turn to Gilberto Chona, who is the lead housing specialist at IDB. Good morning, Gilberto.
Good morning.
Okay, great. So you are an expert in housing, in affordable housing right across the region, Latin America and Caribbean. And what I would love for you to do for us today is really maybe just highlight a few examples of countries where governments and the private sector have worked together to really solve or significantly increase the number of affordable housing units are available. And so not just in terms of where it has happened, but how it has happened. How has the private sector and the government worked together to achieve this?
Well, that's a very relevant question, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I would say the short answer to the question is probably the poster boys for this are Mexico and Chile. There is a little bit of bad news for Jamaica in the sense that countries that have higher and steadily growing GDP per capita are the ones who can do what Mexico and Chile have done. And to some extent, other countries like Panama, perhaps even it was mentioned the Dominican Republic. But basically, the road to this to finding better solutions and to target the low-income housing, the social housing demand starts with a strong capitalization. These countries have learned that investing, that putting money into social housing is not just an expense, a public expense, but it's an important investment sector. But for this, they had to start from understanding the value chain and doing very rigorous analysis of what are the areas and who are the players, what are the needs, like what we're doing now, talking to the players of each of the links of the chain, of the value chain, from the supply side and from the demand side, public sector institutions, private sector firms like investors, banks, and so on and so forth, and to put together a set of policies on the public sector, a set of institutional coordination between public sector and private sector, and identifying the right instruments, not only financial instruments, but also vehicles, programs that address the demand. The diagnostic of the value chain in countries like Mexico or Chile, we did it in Nicaragua. We started doing it in Costa Rica. From my which is my responsibility. It starts with identifying what are the main constraints, and we found, let's say in the case of Mexico, which is very successful, they realized that the mortgages, to issue more mortgages for low-income housing, they needed to provide guarantees, first loss guarantee. Why? Because it's risky, as was mentioned here. It's risky. It's not so attractive if it is not insured that you're going to get the money back if you're a bank. The other example of instruments that they found out that they needed to apply was the guarantees to the construction company, particularly to small construction companies, to make sure that these small construction companies can borrow in the market to invest in this type of projects. Obviously, also the issue of land, and it was mentioned here as well. They had to really put together an understanding of what is the social, they call it the social land that is available, that needs to be upgraded, and that can be and will and has to be made available for low-income housing developments. Otherwise, you leave the market to speculate on these things, and you have a cost structure that is prohibitive. This is very, very complicated. So they did this, but also they put together a platform. A very important element of the success of improving low-income housing is to have a platform that information platform where you can invite everybody to put the data on what land is available, what housing units are being built, which ones are already built, what is the price, what are they by region, by locality, and so on. So to have a full information platform to benchmark the cost structures of low-income housing projects. And they put together a quasi-commercial company to do this. And the other realization, important realization, is that, as was said also here, you will never be probably for the income, the GDP per capita level of a country like Jamaica, you will never be able to catch up with the demand of new units. However, there is a large demand in built housing that is already built, that has needs of improving. Is what we call the qualitative deficit, that it's a very important target for financing, improving the housing unit over time, for instance, to increase the size and the availability of units for rent, or additional space for rent, which becomes a revenue source for the family and becomes a additional supply. And last but not least, they really had a take on rental housing. They say, well, if we cannot sell it, why not produce it? I mean, if people cannot afford to a mortgage,
right. Yeah.
How can we increase the rental market for low-income housing? I would stop there, because there are, of course, many other things and instruments, but it all starts with applying a value chain approach, understanding the value chains, and generating the alliances that will facilitate increasing the supply of low-income housing.
Thank you so much, Gilberto. It's good to have somebody with your expertise as we try and craft around this solution. And you know, at the end of the day, I think from the Economic Policy Committee perspective, we do want to summarize this discussion, put a paper together, and then really have a discussion as to whether or not we should be making a proposal to government. It seems to me that, you know, as you were discussing, there needs to be some kind of subsidy. And the question that I have really for Dwayne is, you know, where does he think that subsidy is best placed, right? You know, we talked about, you know, the government coming in and, you know, providing land or infrastructure and contributing that way really to the developers. But really, I just wanted to get your sense, Dwayne, from an NHG perspective, where you think that the subsidy should be better placed, either with the developer, contractor, or more with the individual person who's trying to acquire the unit.
I think we've explored at the NHD both models. Under our interim finance program, we're able to provide financing to developers who are building at a particular price point, loans to undertake those developments as low as 3%. But what we find works more, and perhaps it's where the NHD is positioned, the NHD will always be assessed greatly based on the direct impact the NHD has on the contributor. So the bulk of the subsidies that the NHD provides actually goes directly to the mortgager in the form of either a direct subsidy in terms of selling the particular unit or the particular lot below whatever is the construction cost or whatever is the development cost, or subsidy as it relates to the financing arrangements generally, and we would have spoken about some of them already, the 0% mortgages, the $2.5 million home grant, the grant to persons with disabilities, and so on and so forth. So there is an argument to be made for both, and the NHD, as I said, we would have explored both aspects of that debate.
Sorry, I was on mute. And what about the rental program? It is true that some of our people who are interested in these units really just can't afford it, right? If you are, somebody who hustles every day for your income, or maybe a household worker who is part-time, doesn't really have a full-time, it's kind of day's work, difficult for you. But maybe a rental program is a little bit easier. Is there a thought of NHD developing houses and really just renting them on a long-term basis?
I've heard the conversation.
Yeah.
And it is one that is a matter of policy, and I would want to say I would reserve that for the policymakers to address that one. Suffice to say, though, that our research would have also indicated that for many Jamaicans, rent often equates to a mortgage in terms of dollar value for so many of the Jamaicans. The challenge individuals oftentimes find is that 5 to 10% deposit that is required, that 2% in legal fees that's required, the valuation report, the surveyor's ID, all of those costs that you're looking at probably between 10 to 20% of the selling price that an individual is expected to have before they can even enter into the mortgage arrangements with whichever financial institution or mortgage provider they are considering. So what we would have done at the NHD is to introduce policies such as 100% financing, where no deposit is required. We only ask for a service charge of $3,500 to assist with the processing of the loan once individuals are selected for NHD schemes. We would have also looked at waiving some of those fees. So no valuation reports are required at the NHD, no surveyor's ID, no legal fees, none of those costs we pass on for the actual NHD developments. What we would have also done for the persons who are using their NHD benefit and working with Michael at VM or Julian at JMD is to allow the contribution refunds that they would ordinarily get a year at a time made available ahead of time. So NHD offers a refund of the contributions every 8 years. We hold them for 7 years, they become eligible for a refund in the 8th year. However, if an individual is purchasing a house on the open market, we make 6 of those 7 years worth of contributions available ahead of time. And the reason we do that is to offset some of these costs that individuals often find prohibitive in undertaking a mortgage. So they can use these refunds to pay for the legal fees, the surveyor's ID, the valuation report, and the deposit. And we find also that we've even gone a step further and worked out a relationship with our credit unions, where we offer a microfinancing loan through about 11 credit unions, an additional $1.5 million that individuals can access and use it to offset pretty much any housing related expenditure from the person who is buying, deposit, all of those fees I spoke about, or the person who is undertaking construction and probably, I don't need a full mortgage of 3, 4, 5. I'm just putting on an additional 1 room. I'm just putting on an additional bathroom. So we've looked at these points that we can identify, and the cost of the unit will always be a challenge. It will always be prohibitive. But what we cannot ignore in terms of solving that challenge where cost is concerned are the financing arrangements that have been put in place, not just from the NHD, but in the general mortgage market in Jamaica. I think we've come a far way from talking about 20% interest rate loans to be talking about 4% at its highest at NHD and averaging around 7.5% across the market.
Excellent. I mean, there are a lot of good ideas here, and I think, you know, what we would want to do is to put some kind of proposal together to see if we can have a discussion with government about how to effect this. I mean, you know, we're into solutions. That's the purpose of having this discussion. It's not really about being a chat box. And I do think that with all the experience and expertise we have here, that there could be some kind of solution that we could suggest based on trying to develop a unit as low as $5 million. Let me invite Paula Bazan, my colleague from IDB Invest. Maybe Paula, you can just talk a little bit about how IDB Invest could potentially help with providing financing for this market in Jamaica.
Thank you, Stefan. My name is Paula Bazan. I work in the manufacturing sector of the IDB Invest, covering the housing sector for the Caribbean region. We have been very active in financing the sector in different countries in the region. I would say mostly in Mexico, in Trinidad and Tobago, in South America, in countries like Peru. What we can be and we can do actually in Jamaica, and we have been doing with different players, is from the very plain vanilla financial solution to corporate loan with the developer or working capital solution for the short term, to providing also one of the, I would say, the most used or appealing products in the market, which has been our partial credit guarantee. When clients with companies, they want to issue bonds in order to secure a project, including low housing projects. So what we can do is we can provide this irrevocable warranty up to certain percentage of the bond issued in this case in Jamaica capital market. Usually it's up to 50%. So this is something that we have been working with clients, and more specifically, and I think that more valuable for clients, has been the thematic bonds, in which we can not only just either participate as an investor in the bond or on the paper, but or being the guarantor, one of the guarantors of the structure. Is that our value added is that we can pick a specific area of sustainability, and that can be the thematic bond that is now internationally recognized. And we can help with internal resources, knowledge, and actually cash. We can help with for the certification, because it's a completely third-party independent qualification or certification for thematic bonds, which these days we have seen like a big increase for investors as a way to go. One of the things that we can provide to complement our financial solutions, either in a corporate loan or in this kind of solution more structured, is we can deploy advisory service that are basically at zero cost for the client, for our counterparty, and that can be either in energy efficiency for the projects, for this, in this case, and actually we have some experience for low income housing, also for international certifications such as LED or EDGE. We can help the project or the client to, or we can finance the certification, and we can have a sustainable building of low income houses. So those are areas, because at the end of the day, and I know that low income has additional challenge, and it was good to know about the default rates, but so knowing that is a perhaps a challenging sector where financing could be kind of like something that could be available, or a commodity. One of the things that can differentiate our intervention is these aspects on certification for if we want to do a capital structure transaction, or our advisory service for different areas related to sustainability, waste, energy, and things like that. So I think that if we can explore those areas, there could be potential financial solutions for the sector in the country.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Paula. I know there are a few people who had raised their hand. One I think is gone, and I do want to bring in some of our participants to hear their perspectives. I think Donovan Wignall had a question, had his hand raised. I don't see it anymore.
Before we take Donovan, Mr. Wright, I just want to remind everyone that, we see your comments in the chat and we'll be acknowledging them shortly. And just to also recognize one of our special guests that we would also want to invite into the conversation just now, who is Mr. David Cummings, VP of Head of Real Estate at Cygnus. So Mr. Cummings, I'm going to invite you as well.
Hi, David, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. Maybe you can give us your thoughts. Good, excellent. Maybe you can give us your thoughts on the role that you could play in potentially financing these developments.
Sure, and certainly good morning to all of the participants in the seminar here. I think it's a great conversation. I just want to make a couple of comments about the value chain on both sides of the value chain, picking up from where Gilbert left off, because I think there are some important components that we need to address. One of which is the approval process, the regulatory framework, because whether you're doing a high-end, some $1 million housing development, or you're doing low-income housing, the process is the same. So from an investor standpoint, if you have to go through the same process, whether you're doing low-income or you're doing developments that have a higher margin, you're going to realize that the focus is going to be more on the larger. So from a regulatory standpoint, maybe some focus could be on truncating the approval process for low-income housing. Another thing that we think we should look at is also and I think Marvin touched on it, the infrastructure cost of it. And it speaks to the development orders and the national spatial plan, because when you're doing a low-income housing, because you have to cost in so many lacking infrastructure parts of it, it makes it more expensive. So when you have to, I personally live in a scheme with 17 units, but we have to have our own sewage treatment, and it drives up the cost of the units by virtue of the fact that you have to cost in a lot of arterial infrastructure costs that should not be on the developer's side. So I guess another one would be, from a policy perspective, the government investing a lot more in arterial infrastructure such that the developer is not burdened with putting in sewage, roads, and those things that ought not to be passed on to the purchaser, because the supply side, the purchaser is already burdened with having a lack of collateral, having a lack of stable income and so on. So to be burdened with the cost of putting in arterial infrastructure that really ought to be the burden of the government, it makes it a further challenge for it to be sort of attractive from an investment standpoint. And the last point on the supply side of the value chain, I'd like to mention, it speaks to technical innovation. I think we've all grown up in an era where block and steel is it, because and yes, we've had experience with Gilbert and earthquakes and so on, but the world has moved on as far as materials are concerned. There was a time when all aircraft were made up of aluminum. Most of new aircraft these days are being made with carbon fiber. So what I'm saying here is, I think the time is right for us to look at innovation in building techniques in Jamaica rather than just block and steel. Are there other ways in which we can lower the cost of delivering a unit by using other materials that will give us the same strength to withstand the Cat 5 hurricane, but will also give us the cushion against earthquakes, but don't come with the intensive labor and the cost associated with block and steel. So in summary, on the supply side, I think, you know, the national spatial plan that will deliver infrastructure to help to lower the cost, the truncated approval process specifically for low-income housing that would serve as an incentive to investors, because clearly, you know, at Cygnus Real Estate Finance, we are first and foremost going to be looking after our investors and our shareholders. We're a public company. So, and the third thing, of course, being, I think time is ripe for us to introduce some technical innovation as a means to, you know, bring in, you know, we have some really great developers in Jamaica, your WIHCONs, your GORs, Chemtex, NHT, and so on. And I think the time is ripe for us to see how can we bring in some of that innovation. And the last point I make is on the demand side of the value chain. I think we all know the problems associated with the demand side. One of which I speak to just very briefly is respect to the low acceptance at times of, based on the location of some of these developments, you know, for whether it is social regions, political boundaries, and so on. Oftentimes, I'm sure the NHT, Dwayne Berbick could probably speak to it, where you develop schemes in areas, but persons may not necessarily want to be there for various reasons, whether it is social, economic, or political. And I think that's another side, the demand side of the value chain. I think that we need to have some dialogue around. But so those are my few words. You know, I just try to give you a perspective, because those are some of the things that we consider as an investor, you know, of Cygnus Real Estate Finance when we are looking at this particular segment of the market.
Thanks a lot, David. And you guys do have an important role, because you're both financier and also developer, albeit not necessarily at this segment of the market. I do see your question, Gilberto, but I also want to acknowledge the many comments that have come in the chat. There are a lot of comments about the importance of a master plan. I see Eleanor Jones and Carol Archer. We fully agree with that. It is important and really creates the entire community, which is really what we're after, the holistic development of these areas. I do want to, let me go to Gilberto with your question, Gilberto.
Yeah, I have two short comments and one commercial to make very quickly. I think there is a virtuous link between green bonds, green mortgages, and green housing solutions for several reasons. I think that's a very important policy and instrumental issue to address a set of needs on the demand side that can be addressed looking forward based on the needs and the vulnerabilities of the demand in low-income housing. That's number one. Number two, I love the previous comment, because one of the lessons that the Mexicans and the Chileans, who are the most advanced in this area of low-income housing, have learned is that you need to coordinate. And they came down with this mandatory approach of what they call sustainable integrated urban development. They basically, what they do is, whenever you're going to do housing, you first have to do the whole development. You have to do community facilities, roads, pipes, sewage, drainage, electricity, even fiber optic, wiring, connectivity wiring, all of that. If not, they basically don't do it. They don't do it anymore. They don't do housing in places where they do the housing, but there are no schools, or the housing, but there's no road. So there is a mandatory coordination that you need to have in order to really lower the cost for the private developers or for the and for the society in general. So there is something very important to address there. And the commercial I wanted to make is that we are starting at the request of the government study to look at the framework for squatters for improving, and we are recommending to use the value chain approach to really analyze the constraints and the possibilities there. And this study will be complemented with a look at what financial instruments can we suggest that will increase the supply of financing for low-income housing solutions. And that is coming in the next year, and probably we will have a very tailor-made solutions for Jamaica soon.
Thank you, Gilbert, and we look forward to your intervention in that respect. But you make a critical point, which is the master plan and putting it all together. I mean, it goes without saying that if you're building housing, particularly affordable housing, low-income housing in areas which have hospitals and schools, then clearly for those people who work there, there's a less transportation cost for the students. And obviously that has a lot to do with safety and security as well. So you're sort of killing many birds with one stone when you do this master plan, and obviously it can be much more sustainable and long lasting. There were some other questions in the chat regarding the role of HAJ and NHD. And I just want to go back to maybe the panelists, and I'll leave this open to whichever one to say really, should NHD be in the business of the construction or development? Is there a role for, should we prioritize the private sector in the actual development and construction aspects and leave more, NHD and other government organizations to do more of the master planning? Who wants to take that? Marvin, can I get a comment from you on that topic?
Well, from our view, I think, everybody has to leverage their own strengths. Mm-hmm. And I think from the developer's perspective, in terms of, the planning out of the development, the execution, the construction, that's our strength. Yeah, and the partnerships do work with NHD. But I believe the NHD, focus in our view should be more around supporting the development through the financing, through also helping to lobby for some of those centralized master planning, right? And also, which they are very good at in terms of the marketing and sales data to kind of help to inform some of the decision-making processes. But I believe from an execution, construction, project management perspective, the developers, I believe, are in a better position to execute on that front, and, bringing in the regulators to just kind of help to fast track some of those approvals, and the ministry as well to kind of help to set some of the regulations and the framework to foster those private-public partnerships.
Excellent. Makes a lot of sense. And it's clear from today's discussion that what is important is the master planning, right? The long-term planning, and then the coordination between the various entities, right? There is definitely a role for, some people don't like when we use this word, but it seems to me that in certain cases, subsidies are needed, whether it be in terms of the government playing a role in putting in additional infrastructure or roads, or making land available, or even on the individual side in terms of discount for mortgages, low interest rates, and so on. And so it really is going to take a coordinated effort to work with both the individual homeowners and then also the developers on that side. Just a reminder that if you do want to ask a question, you can raise your hand. I'm also going through the chat, so you can place one there. Really trying to turn to innovative solutions, right? We are as I mentioned before, really trying to put together the thoughts that have been expressed here and make some kind of presentation to the powers that be as a potential solution. Who knows where it will go, but we are very focused on solutions. And so we do want to at least document our thoughts and put them forward. And what I'm hearing here is that the coordination that can take place and we have the capacity to make happen is really, we think, able to deliver housing units maybe as low as $5 million. And it really is critical, right? We do understand the chronic shortage that there is in Jamaica. And, the truth is, we all know that, part of the reason we have the crime in Jamaica is just people live in situations that they can't live in, right? You can't be living in some of these places and be a productive citizen in society, right? It just doesn't work. And so it is imperative for all of us to really focus on trying to eliminate this, both in terms of the role it can play in the economy, in terms of educational outcomes, the role it can play, obviously, in people generating new businesses and so on, and then all the other social ills, of course, would have an impact on that. Marvin, let me allow you to come in here. You're on mute.
Sorry, just to follow up on a point that David made. The big game changer is really going to come as well when we're looking at alternative building techniques and materials that are available out there. There's a love that Jamaicans have for block and steel and concrete. And so we'll also have to start, re-educating the minds of our citizens that there are alternative materials that are equivalent. And also get, even our insurance companies on board to be able to insure these companies, the banks being willing to provide the mortgages, because, there are modular solutions, there are containerized housing. There's a lot that's going on out there. What you'd have seen in the past, where some of the companies who have tried to provide alternatives than this traditional block and steel have not been very successful. And I believe that's going to require a coordinated approach from all the players to kind of reframe the thinking of the average Jamaican that if it's not concrete, block and steel, then it's not good. And also the risk of still they've been able to get the insurances for these alternative material units, also for the councils and the regulatory agencies to be aware of the approval process, the designs, the checks, because you can stand up to all the design criteria and it doesn't have to be a block and steel. But that's going to take some marketing and reframing of the minds.
And that's really where I really am excited about that potential, right? Because, people have families, they need to live in comfortable settings. But if you do it in block and steel, once you get to 2 or 3 rooms, you're gone way over $10 million. And there are people, who, let's just be honest, will never be able to afford $10 million, right? They have, a couple of children, just the cost of utilities and school fees and all that doesn't really give them the savings or the cash flow to be able to pay that type of mortgage. So we really need to bring down dramatically the cost of these units, right? And if you can have maybe it's some kind of concrete base with some, there've been a number of, building materials, and you know this much better than I do, which are not block and steel, right? It's sort of like a, I'm giving you the layman's term, but a drywall with some steel in it and maybe a sheet of concrete in the drywall, so to speak. So firmer than drywall, but it's not, your traditional block and steel. And, what would you think would be the cost of housing if we were to do, a large development on that scale? Are we talking about trying to get something to, maybe a $3 million unit? Is that possible? You're on mute.
Yes, thanks for that. So WIHCON has been, doing some research around, different building materials, different techniques. I said whether it's a concrete board with metal studs, insulated, so that you still get the heat and cooling effect. And I mean, we're seeing where depending on the solution that you're looking at, you can easily be looking to reduce not just the cost, but the execution time that you spend to build, which can end up with maybe even a 30 to 40% reduction in the overall cost of delivering the unit to the consumer. Because anything you do that reduce your construction time is an automatic saving. And so if you're saving on the material side and also on the execution, the customer is the ultimate beneficiary. And so we're looking into options as well to see how we can truly fast track the pace at which we deliver. Because, you know, if we really want to deliver 70,000 houses in 5 years, it's not likely to happen using the traditional means that we're using now. It's going to be a challenge. Something has to drastically change for that to really be, you know, likely.
Make a lot of sense, Marvin. Dwayne, let me ask you, has there been any, because we know Jamaicans love block and steel. We know that, right? And, you know, we're good at a lot of things, but sometimes we're stuck in our ways too. And it may be difficult to convince people that, you know, this is the home, you know, that you're going to grow your children in or whatever. It's certainly a lot better than what they have now, but there may still be some hesitancy to move forward. Have you guys done any kind of research or based on your experience, have any kind of understanding of whether Jamaicans would go for something less than block and steel in a massive way?
I support Marvin on this point. I think it's really going to need a major, it's not even a mindset change. I think it's a behavior change and a major cultural shift. You know, in the Jamaican market, and I marvel all the time. I observe persons, they walk into the units and the first thing they do, they knock on the wall and they check if it sounds hollow and they try to decipher, you know, what kind of building material is it? How thick are the blocks? You know, is there steel in there? Is there no steel? So seeing that, what the NHD has done, however, though, we're committed to finding these alternative building solutions to, with a view to pull down the construction costs. And one of the things that we're doing locally currently is to invest in some research, and we've added a research and development arm to our construction team in recent years. And one of the projects they're working on is looking at bamboo as part of the building material mix. And we are developing, we've committed in the region of $54 million to research there and developing a plant at a community called Peckham in Clarendon, where we're looking at assisting the residents in finding bamboo byproducts that they can use for, you know, their general sustainability there. And also from the NHD's perspective, you know, conducting the necessary research, trying out some models, hopefully, to see if we can include that as part of the material mix. In addition, we have approximately 4 parcels of land that we've made available under our developers program. Land at Galena in St. Mary, also land at Barrett Hall in St. James, at Mount Nelson in Manchester, and one other site that's eluding me right now. But we are also putting those lands on the market, and we're saying to developers, if you have an alternative building material model, we want to actually see it, and we're making the land available for you to put it, you know, into actual construction. And we hope through that it would make the process of selling this building material a little bit easier, because persons would be able to actually see the housing units built with this alternative building, whether it's a technology or the material, all of that, and also see it and experience it and make it available for persons. So hopefully that will go a far way in assisting in terms of the behavior change and the cultural shift that we know we will need to have with exploring with alternative building solutions and materials.
Excellent, excellent. And it's also important that these building materials are economical, right? Because many of them, you know, they're not produced here, they're imported. Certainly what is going on in the global logistics chain now would not make it any cheaper in this environment. We hope that's temporary, but it is important that when we look at these alternative solutions, that they also be cost effective, because at the end of the day, that's really what we're trying to get to. I do see 2 hands raised. Let me ask Carol Archer, Dr. Carol Archer, to come in, and then after her, Antheo Jackson.
Hold on. Good morning, everyone. Just a question or comment, really. We've been focusing on home ownership. And I'm wondering if we need to look at solutions around the rental market and look at perhaps even subsidies for the rental market, because there are certain segments of our population that unfortunately we will not be able to provide housing at that level for ownership. So I think we need to give some consideration to that. And we also need to give some consideration. Stefan, I would have sent you the paper that we recently published around also getting the feedback from both householders and developers as to the type of units that can be constructed based on, you know, the appetite for the kind of housing solution, so that there is a sort of meeting of the mind, both from the consumer perspective and the developer perspective. We need to look at the rental market as well.
Yeah, excellent points, Carol. We did talk about the rental market a little bit earlier. Dwayne had mentioned that, you know, nothing conclusive has come out of NHT on that yet. It's something that they have discussed, but clearly, you know, there's a role for it, right? And the truth is, in Jamaica, you know, we need all solutions, right? We have such a huge problem. You know, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a significant number of Jamaicans live on a gully bank, right? I mean, people are trying to find place anywhere, right? Just because of the economic opportunity. You know, the standard thing is they come from country, they don't know anybody in town, and they find somewhere to catch. And the catch goes from 1 week to 1 month, and all of a sudden, that's where the children are growing up and walking on a gully bank to go to school. So we need many solutions, right? And there's just a huge opportunity to get into this. Mr. Jackson, is it Mr. Jackson?
Good morning, It's
Miss Jackson, okay. Welcome, go ahead with your question.
Thank you so much. Morning, everyone. Just piggybacking on something Prof. Archer said and points mentioned earlier, just to bring the voice of the household, which is the ultimately the consumer in the conversation. We recently did a research at the University of Technology where we interviewed about 439 persons who benefited from housing developments that would have been, you know, produced through the NHT, HAG, and so on. And we wanted to get a sense from these beneficiaries. How do you feel about what has been provided, and what were the factors that influenced your housing choice? And what we uncovered in our research is that the main things that the householders take account of, we expected affordability to have been the top consideration. Of course, we were surprised that affordability was important, but more so as a precondition to accessing the market. When you ask them about the adequacy of what was provided, they commented largely on the soundness of the structure and the community environment. So the point about the building materials that are being used is important to build awareness, because even if there are sound materials out there, solid, affordable material that the householders are unaware of, then that skepticism about securing such units will continue to persist. So a part of the solution needs to be a massive educational awareness campaign about what are the materials, how they have held up in other territories. One of your presenters spoke about Mexico and other areas where, you know, affordable housing solutions have been tried and, you know, have proven to be worthwhile. So I think it's important that we speak to people, we meet them at the level where their concerns are. And the whole notion of community being such an important factor, the neighborhood attributes. Do they have access to housing, school, adequate transportation? That underscores the need for us to look seriously and urgently at that spatial plan, that master plan. Because housing, we cannot continue to interpret housing as dwelling. If we interpret housing as dwelling unit, then we will continue to provide units that may be of good standard, but fail to achieve what is needed from housing as an overall product to householders. So just a comment where that is concerned. But I also want to just quickly make a mention about how we look at affordability in the market. And this came up from the study as well, where when we calculated what the householders' perception of affordability is, they seem to have a higher tolerance for, housing costs than we perceive. And I understand that the financial sector obviously has to be concerned about the risk. And so that 30% threshold that we look at, it would seem to me that the householders have a higher tolerance for, I suppose, housing cost, providing that the housing is accounting for their overall needs. So I just want for us to revisit the conversation, bringing the householder into the conversation even more so, and to get a better understanding as to what is their tolerance as it relates to payment. There are some unconventional ways that persons do earn. The financial sector also needs to be able to make some adjustments, the lenders, to take account of these other areas of income and sources of income for these low-income householders that we're speaking of.
Right. No, those are excellent points, Anithio, and thank you for that. And we will access the research report that you had just mentioned. I see one more hand up, Dayton Wood. I'm going to ask you to ask your question or make your comment, and then I'm just going to go around my panelists one more time to really get a final comment on any sort of innovative solutions that they may have, or maybe what they think is most important in terms of encouraging the private sector to play a more critical role in solving this affordable housing crisis we have in Jamaica. We only have 3 minutes left. So Dayton, I'm going to give you 30 seconds and then 30 seconds to each of the panelists.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and morning, everyone. Just to follow up on what has been said already by Marvin, and I think everybody, infrastructure cost is roughly 25% of the cost of delivering a housing solution. Mm-hmm. It is my view that greenfield developments provide additional long-term income for government through property taxes, long-term income for the utility companies, and therefore the upfront cost of putting in that infrastructure. Ways need to be found to fund it on a long-term basis, maybe from bonds, government bonds at low interest rate, which the utilities can pick up a portion thereof and pay it off over a longer period of time, with the developer picking up a smaller percentage of it. This, I think, will go a long way in bringing the cost of housing down for the very needy in society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dayton. And that is a recurring theme of our discussion this morning. And so we will definitely prioritize that as we put our thoughts together. So let me just go through now for a sort of final round. So Marvin, any thoughts, sort of final thoughts, any innovative solutions, or maybe, from your perspective, the number one priority to help us get to a situation where we could be potentially producing, more than 10,000 units a year on average?
Well, one thing I'd like for us to leave with is partnerships. I think that's what's going to be the key to the overall success. And we have seen when we have had partnerships, let's say with the NHG through the JVs or with the Ministry of Housing in terms of utilizing their land banks, those have been very beneficial to the homeowners. And so if we no longer approach this issue of mass housing from an individualistic, each developer, each company kind of doing their own thing in isolation, we'll look at it collectively at a national level, at a national issue, and approach it jointly through partnership. I believe that's what's going to make a difference.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marvin. Dwayne?
Yeah, I wrote that word down as well, partnerships. And the NHT is an institution that has been built on partnerships. Partnerships with our contributors, partnerships with our mortgagors, partnerships with our employers, partnerships with developers, partnerships with financiers, and we are committed to reviewing those partnerships in this rather dynamic environment where the factors of production where housing is concerned are changing. The needs and appetites of the mortgages are changing. The financing arrangements need to change as well. So we are committed to reviewing those partnerships and to ensure that we're constantly not just present, but we're at all times relevant to the needs of all the players in the market. And I'll finally end with what Ms. Jackson ended with, that we are also committed not just to building houses, but building communities, safe, vibrant, holistic communities with green spaces. We've established basic minimum standards for our schools, green spaces, play area for children, recreational areas, and with partnerships and that kind of approach to housing in terms of building communities and building sustainable communities, I believe we can go a far way in doing our Jamaican people right where housing is concerned.
Excellent, Dwayne. Thank you so much. Michael, final comment from you?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, that central master plan is absolutely critical, and it has to be a very strong, directed plan that can guide everybody below. Obviously, the financial players have been playing a key role. There's obviously a need for more financing and more innovative financing to apply to this particular sector. Cost is a very significant factor in the solutions that are or the communities that are being delivered. And financing is one factor, but the building methods are another. You made a good point. You made a good point in that we really have to focus on solutions that we can develop ourselves as opposed to import, because we'll be back to square one with all the a significant part of the inputs being imported and being costed in.
Sure. And the local materials are important.
We made a very good point with in terms of the efforts they are making with bamboo and other methods. That's a way would be a way of reducing our costs and kind of insulating ourselves against the import cost.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. Julian?
Sorry, I was really tight. Oh, sorry, it's the other Julian. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. Do you have a comment, Shadow Minister?
No, well, I just typed some things in the chat. Really, one was I do believe the government can do more in terms of subsidizing the upfront infrastructure costs, but there has to be an assurance that once they do that, those costs are passed on to the end user. We have about 200,000 persons who are seeking a unit between, I would say, $7 to $10 million. And there are a number of issues: access to land, which is flat, which is close to town centers. That's critical. Getting approvals from different government agencies so it don't take 2 years before you can start a project. So I believe there's a lot more we can do. NHC is spending $57 billion this financial year. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to dent in any significant way the amount of persons who need and would qualify for a starter unit, so to speak. So there are some other issues beyond and the cost of the units and the input costs. Those are real issues, but there are some other things that I believe can be done that can help to alleviate the problems of getting to that 200,000 that we need to supply.
Excellent, Shadow Minister. Thanks for your contribution. Mr. Julian Mayer, let me be specific.
Always good to hear from an MC.
Yes.
I think, no need to go and create an additional item. I think we have our sites squarely focused on the things that can move the needle, whether it is building materials or any of the other items that were discussed. Where I would really focus is really that infrastructure space. I think if you listen to the comments from Dayton Wood, he would have highlighted on the government side the different stakeholders that would have some form of benefit and long-term benefit from having infrastructure put in place, whether it is the utilities companies or the government themselves from land taxes and so forth. That's just some of the potential investors that could come to the table to support infrastructure. Infrastructure is really what moves the needle in this space. We've seen it, we've discussed it many times here this morning. And it's an area that the private sector can step up so long as we hit the other critical criteria, which is that these plans are well developed, well thought out, and have scale, so that there is an economic justification for the infrastructure to be put in place to bring investors to the table. So I think the discussion so far has highlighted the items that move the needle, and we stand ready to go and support.
Excellent. Final comment from you, Gilberto Chona.
Very quickly, Fordism in housing production is dead. It's a dead paradigm. Remember John Gale, first the people, then the places, then the buildings. The other way around will never work. The jury is out there for concrete bricks and mortar. Think things like materials like locally sourced, sustainable, renewable wood, like bamboo and others, aluminum, glass. Why not to lower the cost of mass housing, which is produced in a more resilient and sustainable way? These are the realities that we have, and those are the challenges, the opportunities that we have to innovate, to solve a very important problem for the people.
Thank you so much, Gilberto, and thanks to my expert panel, Dwayne, Berbick, Marvin, Campbell, Julian Mayer, Michael, Neita, and thanks also to the contributions from Paula Bazan and David Cummings. Thank you all so very much for coming and participating. Thanks to our participants who asked questions and were engaged and help us to formulate our thoughts on this topic. The idea is that we will put something together in terms of a document. Not sure where it will go yet or who will listen, but I think it's important for us to sort of just write down our thoughts in terms of how we can potentially make a contribution to eliminating the squatter settlements that we have all over Jamaica and really making affordable housing much more available for our Jamaicans. Thank you so very much and have a great weekend.